sought to assure South Africans that Treasury doesn't have the scope to hike taxes. However, South Africans are still pessimistic. The government's plan to austerity measures will come at the expense. The minister's comment comes as Treasury is gearing up for the upcoming budget speech. Now, Minister Godongwana stressed that the country's finances are in a dire state, that it's failing to meet its tax collection targets. So how could this impact ordinary South Africans who are trying just to get by? For more on this, we're joined by the Head of Strategic Engagement and Compliance at Tax Consulting. That's Jashwin Baijoo. Hello and welcome to Radio 786.
Good afternoon.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Jashwin, does Treasury potentially have the scope to hike these taxes?
So, yes. But it's not as quick as overnight they decide, listen, there's a tax hike. There's an entire process that must be followed. And ultimately, I mean, even if we look at our finance minister hinting at possible tax increases over the last couple of weeks, if not months, the whole aim of this is to supplement what is essentially a shrinking tax base by imposing further pressure on those who are still within SARS's tax net.
Jashwin, just on that and looking at some of those issues, I mean, considering the previous austerity measures also implemented by the state, how likely is it that government will use tax to ensure that financial stability?
It's highly likely. I mean, if we think about it rationally, what are other options? We have instances where there's state bailouts, which is ultimately the state bailing out itself. But there has to be some revenue funnel to actually fund that and to fund infrastructure in the country and to fund the millions and billions that go to grants for poorer South Africans. Now, from the actual collection perspective, I mean, there was a statement a couple of days ago where Commissioner Kieswetter said that they're losing out on 200 to 300 billion in tax revenue due to the proliferation of criminal syndicates in the country. And if we think back to hard lockdown, it was the illicit cigarette trade. SARS is losing out on tax revenue there. Now it's just criminal syndication in general. And yes, SARS have gotten far more aggressive in their tax collections, especially on the tax debt side. We've seen a spike in the issuance of civil judgments. We've seen a spike in SARS dipping directly into a taxpayer's bank account, and taxpayer wakes up with literally nothing left in that account. So yes, they've ramped up their collection measures. However, it's becoming evident more and more each day that this is not enough to fill the fiscal pothole.
Indeed, and that is a great concern. And I think for many South Africans, in trying to avoid, the bank accounts being drained, is how do we get around this legally? I think is what's important is how can we get around this potential tax hike?
Look, so getting around the potential tax hike is more of a parliamentary legislative issue where registered controlling bodies, together with certain tax organizations, will make submissions to Parliament either in favor of or against any proposed tax hikes. Now, I obviously have a bit of insight there, as I do sit on one of the RCB tax committees that make these submissions. So that is the legal route. Now, for taxpayers, and I think that is definitely the listener's concern, they're not too fussed about how legislation becomes legislation. They don't really care. What they need to know is, if I owe SARS R500,000 rand, what do I do? And the answer is to prevent a garnishee order being issued against your employer and to prevent a third-party appointment being issued to your preferred bank, is to approach SARS diligently and proactively, firstly. And secondly, if it really is a case where a taxpayer cannot afford to settle that tax liability for a number of reasons, it could be that they don't have the financial means currently. Maybe it's because the interest and penalties have snowballed over the years and now the current debt is beyond their proportions of affordability, or life has just delivered some hard knocks. There are ways to survive SARS's tax debt collection tactics. such as a compromise of tax debts, a deferral of payment, and where SARS are approached correctly and strategically, we do find that they are amicable in certain instances. And yes, they're aggressive where nothing is done by the taxpayer, but where they're approached and that accountability is shown, as well as a voluntary willingness to be compliant, we do find them amicable to payment arrangements and in some instances, even reductions of tax debt due.
It's Jashwin Baijoo. He is the head of strategic engagement and compliance at Tax Consulting, speaking to us as Finance Minister Idong Godongwana as to ensure South Africans rather show us that Treasury doesn't have the scope to hike taxes. And there has been a concern, of course, around seeing how aggressive SARS has been in collecting on those revenues. But Jashwin's advice there is, of course, to be proactive if you find that you are unable to pay or to return those taxes, to approach SARS and then do the necessary. And in most cases, SARS is nice about it.